Good evening, and welcome to Intellectual Publics. I'm Ken Wissaker, and I direct the program along with Stephanie Gayet. Thank you all for coming at this very busy time in the term. I think we're in for something very special. In mid-November, I was in Tampa for the annual meeting of the American Anthropological Association. Association of Black Anthropologists put together a program that ran through the meeting and was a highlight of the whole event. As part of that fabulous program, there was a panel on Aisha Beliso-De Jesus's book, Cited Delirium, that is the center of our discussion tonight. Panel with Deborah Thomas, Sean Brotherton, Kamari Clark, Anna Muniz, Dana Davis, and others, which was a highlight of the meeting for me, one of the best book panels I've ever been at. The way each of the panelists felt about the book, learned from it, thought of it as a model for future students and for scholarly writing, it was something special. Tonight, with Aisha here in conversation with Yomaira Figueroa-Vásquez, we'll get a more in-depth and intimate chance to think about the topics in the book, at once a cultural anthropology, a study of fake medicine, a way of writing in a personal and spiritually guided mode, in a place where so many issues of Black Latinx life and thinking come together. It's a remarkable achievement. Aisha Beliso-De Jesus is a cultural and social anthropologist who has conducted ethnographic research with Santeria practitioners in Cuba and the United States, and police officers and communities of color affected by police violence in the US. Cited Delirium examines the medicalization of police violence. Beliso-De Jesus unravels how excited delirium syndrome, a fabricated medical diagnosis, has been used to justify and erase police violence against Black and Brown communities, where she exposes the inextricable ties to the criminalization of Afro-Latina religions. Aisha's first book, Electric Santeria, Racial and Sexual Assemblages of Transnational Religion from Colombia, won the 2016 Albert Rabbitoh Award for the best book in Africana religions. She's currently completing another book for Duke, I'm proud to say, Zombie Patrol, Policing African Diaspora Religions, on the criminalization of Black and Latina religions, issues of animal sacrifice, policing, race, and constitutional questions of religious freedom in the US. She has also just co-edited a volume for Princeton on the anthropology of white supremacy, a reader, coming out soon, I think, which will bring together anthropologists from across the globe to interrogate, dismantle colonial, political, and economic structures of white supremacy, analyzing it as a global phenomenon. Beliso-De Jesus has also spearheaded ethnographic research on police use of force in New Orleans, and which was funded by the National Science Foundation. She is the co-founder and co-director of the Center on Transnational Policing at Princeton, and she has just finished her term as editor-in-chief of Transforming Anthropology, the flagship journal of the Association of Black Anthropologists. And tonight, we're very excited to have her in conversation with Yomaira Figueroa-Vásquez, native of Puerto Rico, who was born and raised in Hoboken, and is a first-gen high school and college graduate. She is now professor of Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino studies at CUNY Hunter, and directora of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies Centro, such a fabulous institution. She earned her MA and PhD in comparative ethnic studies at University of California, Berkeley. And prior to joining the faculty at CUNY, she was associate professor of global Afro-diaspora studies in the Department of English at Michigan State. She is the author of the award-winning book, Decolonizing Diasporas, Radical Mappings of Afro-Atlantic Literature from Northwestern, which examines the textual, historical, and political relations between diasporic Afro-Puerto Rican, Afro-Cuban, Afro-Dominican, and Equato-Guinean literary poetics. It was translated into Spanish in 2023 And she's currently at work on a new book project, The Survival of a People, coming out from Duke, which examines the disappearances and excesses of Afro-Puerto Rican island and diasporic peoples through the study of family stories, archival histories, photography, visual art, and film from the late 19th century to the present. A scholar and organizer, she was founder of the Michigan State Women of Color Initiative, the Collaborative Study Away Project, I won't even try to pronounce that badly, and the important digital material site, Taller Electric Marinage. And she also led the Michigan State Mentoring Underrepresented Scholars in English program. She is the PI and co-director of the Diaspora Solidarities Lab, a Mellon-funded higher learning project focused on Black feminist digital humanities, supporting solidarity work in Black and ethnic studies. And she was this year just awarded a huge $6.4 million grant from the Mellon Foundation to support her rooted and relational vision for Centro, an expansive 5-year plan to transform the research and community impact of Centro, from which we all benefit. They're going to come on in a second, and I just want to let you know the chat is open, but if you have questions for the speakers, please put them in the Q&A where they can more easily find them. Aisha and Yomaira will talk until about 7:40 or 7:45 Eastern, and then we will open up for questions. Thank you all for being here, and I think it's going to be very special.
Thank you so much, Ken, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you so much, Stephanie and Ken, for the invitation to be in conversation with Aisha. I'm really excited about this conversation. And I'm really thankful to everyone that's here today. It's December, it's the end of the year, a very difficult time for us for many, many reasons. And I don't take it lightly that people would join us. And then for those who are going to see this later, hello. And thank you so much for watching and for listening in on this conversation about this incredible, incredible book. So just thank you. And thank you, Aisha, for being here and for allowing me to be your interlocutor,
Thank you so much. First, I want to say thank you to Yomaira for this, taking the time out of your busy job at the Centro, which I know is a lot of work, and we're so grateful to have you there. And of course, Ken and Stephanie for organizing this and for asking us to do this. And I'm so grateful for all of the support and, this time for everyone who's made it out tonight or logged in.
Yeah, made it out to their living rooms. I love it.
Made it out to their phones or.
Yeah, thank you. So today we're going to talk about Excited Delirium. I have this book. I sent Aisha a picture this weekend of my son annotating. He was looking at me annotating the book, and he himself decided that he too wanted to annotate in the margins of the book. So it was a family affair. But congratulations on this beautiful book, your second book. I mentioned to you before that I finished reading the book and I was hysterically crying, just emotional overflow, right? It is a really intense project that you've undertaken in such a beautiful, generous, and caring way. At some points, you can also feel the rage of your writing coming through as you're reading these documents, medical examiner documents, police documents. You're going through the archive of police violence and state violence against Black people. And it is a lot to hold as the writer. And yet, and in so many ways, I felt so cared for as a reader. You went to places and then kind of pulled back a little bit, right? Like allowing like a breathing room for people to be able to turn the page. There's something really beautiful about that method. And I do want to talk with you about method later on in this conversation. I want to begin though by asking you to take us on the journey with you to writing this book, from Electric Santeria to Excited Delirium. Tell us about the paths that opened for you. What were the pathways that you followed and that led you to creating this book? And I can't wait to talk a little bit more about the details, but I want you to tell us about this journey.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for starting there. I think it's clear that the book is itself meant to be both experienced as a journey, but it also because it developed in many ways while I was writing the other book that Ken was mentioning, right, which was actually while I was doing this research with police officers and really practitioners on the criminalizing of Santeria in the US, you know, I ended up inadvertently entering into, I think, what ended up being a kind of research rabbit hole that I think all of us have experienced at one point in time as scholars, right? Where you think you're starting sort of down a journey, you think you're writing like a chapter or a section of a chapter, and then that slowly becomes bigger and bigger and bigger until it's something else. And I think for me, that was in many ways marking also a series of becomings around like who I was as a scholar and a researcher, and the ways that I had to navigate my own sort of sense of both being in the world and also encountering research that for me was actually very traumatizing, right? I think one of the things that it was really, I think, hard to wrestle with was the fact that there's not really a lot of conversations around how do you deal with scholarship that impacts you deeply as you're writing it. You know, people don't usually talk about your like own experience as a scholar dealing with these kinds of traumas, this violence, this racial violence that impacts both our communities, our families, our bodies, ourselves, our children, and then having to, translate that through the scholarship process. And so when I was doing this research, I found myself, in a series of, sort of encounters that were confronting me and that I couldn't deny any longer. And so part of this, the journey of writing this book and what I try to do in the text itself for the reader is to sort of bring you along with me as I unravel my experience encountering a topic that as someone who studies police violence, I had never heard of, right? And that's this fabricated syndrome called excited delirium, which, I was surprised. And, so many times I do this, these talks and people really have not heard of excited delirium syndrome, right? And it's this idea that, that somehow Black and Latina people, especially, Black people are considered to have a sort of genetic defect to sort of up and die spontaneously around police officers. And so as I uncovered excited delirium while I was doing this research on the criminalizing of Santeria, I realized that a book needed to be written that explicitly sort of addressed the history around how this term came to be, and then also surprisingly how it intersects with the criminalizing of Afro-Cubans and Afro-Cuban religions in the 1980s. And that's something that I think was both shocking to me and also in many ways sort of part of the reason why I was the one doing this work. In terms of like what led me to this research, right? So I don't want to give away too much of the details of it because I know you have a lot of questions, but
yeah. No, but thank you, because I think it's very clear, and from the very beginning of the book, you're leading us on this journey, right? Like you're having, as you're talking about these encounters, talking with people, and there's these uncanny moments, right? When you're like, wait, hold on a second, what's your father's name? Hold on, what did you say? Right? And so, as a reader, you're like, well, what is going on here? This is not like a book I have read before, right? And I think that that's what makes it so beautiful and exciting. So in the book, you tell us about excited delirium. That's the title of the book, Race, Police Violence, and the Invention of a Disease that is not recognized by anyone, but is used by medical examiners and by police officers to as an excuse, right, for the deaths of Black people in police custody. And also, it stems from a much longer history of kind of neglecting and like swatting away Black death, right, and Black murder, right. In it, you reveal this unanticipated roots of this, right, like unanticipated roots of this fake disease that is wielded by the state, right, as having roots in the policing of Afro-Latina religious syncretic practices, right, and spirituality, and that it is likewise rooted in police violence. These things are never separated, right? Throughout the book, you're showing the ways that they are coming together, right? And then later on, you show how they come together also with sexual violence, right? And so I would love if you could tell us a little bit about how Whetley, this is that how you say it? Whetley?
Yes, Whetley.
Whetley, this medical examiner and propagandist. I don't even know. I don't have a good name for him. But anyway, how he it begins to develop the idea for excited delirium through his engagement with Marielitos, Black Cubans, and Black Cuban sacred practices. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and maybe talk to us a little bit about the kind of precursor to this excited delirium, which is the cocaine sex deaths,
Yeah.
right, and how that builds up?
Yeah, so in the 1980s, right, this medical examiner, Charles Whetley, right, is making the argument that, Black people are dying spontaneously over small amounts of cocaine. Now, what becomes even more surprising as I'm sort of going through this research is that he also, at the same time that he's sort of making this genetic eugenicist argument, right, around cocaine and sort of Black death, he's also, studying the bodies and the tattooed bodies of Afro-Cubans who arrive on his table, his medical examiner's table, and this is during the period of time that has been known as the Satanic Panic, right, which is a broader conspiracy that has, been debunked several times over. But that circulates within law enforcement and also within, therapy and psychotherapy more broadly, that in many ways brought together like Christian evangelical fears with, anti-gaming culture, right? So you might recall this being tied to sort of the dungeons and, the sort of anti-gaming hysteria that was happening in the 80s. And so what happens is people in this so-called cult circuit become celebrated as experts, and it's a lucrative economy within the law enforcement circuit. And Whetley becomes a self-proclaimed expert on Afro-Cuban religions at this time, with very little, actually, no knowledge about the religious practices themselves. And so while he's excavating the tattooed bodies of Afro-Cubans and making all of these criminalized associations with Afro-Cuban religions, he's also arguing around what, he has many names for it. One of them is cocaine agitated delirium, excited delirium syndrome. But what he's arguing is that there's this predisposition amongst Black people. And he starts testing this theory when 12 Black women are found raped and murdered in Miami at the time. And he convinces the CDC, he convinces the FBI and the police to close their cases, and argues that these Black women were not raped and murdered, but were actually what he describes as cocaine sex deaths. And he actually makes the argument that whereas Black men, he argues, die spontaneously after becoming sweaty and aggressive around police officers, Black women die after sex and cocaine. And so this argument that he pulls together, in many ways forms the sort of basis through which he's able to launch his career even further as a law enforcement expert. And of course, that gets us into a whole host of other things that becomes very lucrative beyond this moment in excited delirium, which I'm sure we'll probably talk about. But one of the things that's really crucial to understand, and this is what I try to sort of demonstrate in the book, is that the techniques and the practices that he uses to establish himself as a so-called expert really begin right on the testing of Afro-Cubans and then get ramped up through the medicalization of police violence in excited delirium syndrome.
And it's really incredible. I think it can also be like unbelievable once you start to read, right? Like, reading the chapters of this book and the way that you like swiftly move, right? You're like, here's a little bit of this. Here, we'll talk a little bit about the form of the book and
Yeah.
and the kind of genre, but you move us through, and there's moments where you're like, this cannot be real. This cannot be real. This is, how can so many people believe this, right? And so you can imagine that, like, we have 12 Black women. It's like African American women, Afro-Cuban women, and Black Puerto Rican women,
Yep.
Afro-Puerto Rican women murdered, right, as part of this like large like serial murder like practice that's happening in Miami in this moment. And
Yeah.
just one man can just shoo away, right, the investigation, be like, no, there's nothing wrong here. These women are just biologically inferior, and also criminal, and also there's all these other things happening with who they are as non-humans, right, essentially. And so just don't worry about it. And it's
Yeah.
not until way later, right, many more murders are happening, that then all of these cases are reviewed. And so you talk also, like, you're also bringing in scholarship from all different parts, right, of the academy, but also beyond that, right? And so you mentioned like the work of Terry Williamson, who does work on Black women and serial murder in the Midwest. And you're also linking this, right, to the ways that the state itself is engaging with and problematizing the presence of the Marielitos, right? These like
Right.
Black Cuban migrants that they don't know what to do with, right? These are not the people that they wanted to help, right? And so they find themselves at this like political crossroads. And so hand in hand, right, Wetly with this kind of anti-Black state apparatus are able then to like very easily diminish all of these lives as criminal, sexual deviants, and people who basically brought their deaths upon themselves, right? And then, so you lay this groundwork for us at the very beginning. You also lay it through ceremony, right? Like you're talking to us about ceremony and through ceremony, through Santeria, and through different people's initiation. So there's this kind of like initiation, like there's like beautiful waves, right? That kind of puncture the book itself, offering, I think, the reader this moment of like respite, right? You're like just a moment, even in even your painful and maybe even sometimes pained journal entries that like kind of are at the end of every chapter, where you're like giving us the kind of a background of what's happening. They also give us the moment to breathe, right? To breathe through your experience. And through it, you also talk to us about your journey as a scholar, as a young woman, your family's journey to Hawaii, right? At the in 1899 and 1900, after Huracán San Ciriaco. You are part of, the group of like Cali Ricans, right? The California Puerto Ricans,
Right.
and have long roots in that place. Can you tell me a little bit more about what, like, the space of California, this other geography of like Puerto Rican diaspora and Afro-syncretic practice in like the far west state, right? How does that impact or influence the way that you take up this book, right?
Thank you. You did such a beautiful job at bringing so many of the layers together that I have tried to put in there. So I'm really grateful for your generosity of spirit and also your reading of the text. I think one of the things that I grew up in the wake of the Satanic Panic as a practitioner. My family's practitioners of Afro-Cuban religions, born and raised in the Cali Rican community of the West Coast. Dancers, musician, artists, activists, like that's like my community. And also the community was being criminalized by the very techniques of the state that were creating excited delirium syndrome, right? And so I think that one of the, I did offer these journal entries both as a way to sort of counter the representational violence of the state, right? Because there's a way in which when you read and when you do scholarship from criminalized documents, you inadvertently, right, can have the tendency to reproduce the very same narratives that you're trying to undo, right? And as a result of that, I think what I wanted to do through the ethnographic journal entries was to provide a counter representation and narrative that both on the one hand, shows how our community existed, right, and came together and forged pathways of diaspora, and also in relation to the violence of the state, right? So my family, are ongoing active practitioners who are utilizing Lukumi practices as a way to offer healing rituals, right, to the families of those who have been killed, like Oscar Grant's family, and Mario Woods's family, right? And so in many ways, they intersect directly, right, with the ongoing abolitionist project, right? And so there's the simultaneity of the journal articles themselves, the journal entries themselves, and very much as a way to, the first round of this book didn't have the journal entries, and it was rough to read. It was rough to write, and it was rough to read. And one of the reviewers from I recall said that it was hard to get through, because it was also hard for me to encounter so much death, so much violence. And what I ended up having to do was actually, some people go to like a therapist, other people will go to like if they're Christian, they'll go to a pastor. Like in our practices, we go to our family, so we go to a spiritualist, we get, cleansed, we get healed. And so for me, it made sense to, to in that time of need, go to where I could get healing, right? And so, I think the ways that the criminalization of Afro-Cuban religions is so deeply intertwined with the kinds of racialized police violence that we don't really understand, right? And so I wanted us to also think clearly about how African-American, Afro-Latine practices are sort of not bifurcated, but rather like intimately intertwined together. And that was something that was really crucial, both within the practitioners' experiences, but then also the criminalization. And so that was a key element of the writing.
So much of that shines through. And I think when you talk about the kind of counter narratives of the journal, there's and the kind of like these ethnographic notes, they kind of buttress up against, you have antagonists in here, right? Like it's como una telenovela, you know what I'm saying? Like it's like, oh my God, ¿qué va a pasar ahora? But then you have someone who's basically a native informant to Wheatley, right? Like you have this other kind of person here that is inadvertently providing, right, very damaging information and fueling, right, this panic around Santeria, and then it perhaps inadvertently also fueling the continuation of unchecked police violence. Can you talk to us a little bit about your kind of relationship with this figure in the book?
Yes, so it's a very complicated dynamic, because when I first started doing research on the policing of Santeria, it was right after the murder of Trayvon Martin, and a few police officers who were also practitioners of Santeria and Palo actually reached out to me. This was when I was still at Harvard University, and I had finished writing Electric Santeria. And they wanted me to actually help them get these police trainings on Santeria restarted in Florida, because the trainings had gone defunct. And what they were noticing was that there was a sort of uptick in violence and targets towards Afro-Cuban religions. And as practitioners and police officers, they were concerned about some of the ignorance that was happening. And so I sort of went along with them to start doing research, preliminary research. I didn't agree to like do trainings or anything. I was more sort of feeling out the terrain at that time. And when I did that, I ended up doing a lot of research on the police academy, on doing ride-alongs, and also interviewing a number of people who were training police officers or who had been training police officers. And interestingly enough, when I started writing the book, I had, I started working with a practitioner who was, undergoing the process. She was Afro-Latina trans woman who was about to go through her Santeria initiation. And a few weeks before I went to interview her, I had just been told that her father had passed away as a result of police interactions, but I didn't know anything else. And when I had been, for some reason, I started seeing cases about excited delirium syndrome, and I sort of ended up going on this strange sort of investigative research rabbit hole, and just case after case after case in the archives on excited delirium syndrome and what was happening there. And when I went to go interview Jade, within the first few minutes, she mentioned that her father had sort of up and died. And now the way that these people who are claimed to be excited delirium, the argument is that they get sweaty and agitated and suddenly, spontaneously, basically it's like they combust, right? They have heart failure and they die. And so the term that's used is really kind of this, up and died. And when she said that, I stopped for a moment and I looked at her and I said, wait a minute, was your father an excited delirium? And she said, yes. How did you know? And that was the sort of the beginning of this journey. Well, it turns out that when I went back and I started looking at who coined the term, this was before I even knew that Charles Wheatley was involved in any of this, I realized that the person who coined the term was actually someone that I had worked with, who I had interviewed 10 years earlier when I was doing this research in Miami with the police officers. And so I couldn't believe this coincidence. And I ended up going back and re-interviewing Rafael Martinez, who is a Cuban. He was a Peter Pan kid, which he was brought in the early 1960s. When fleeing communism, they allowed a group of children to come on the plane by themselves and meet with family members. And so he was one of these. And he ended up working with Wheatley, helping Wheatley's research on tattoos of the Marielitos. And so that ended up sparking a whole host of a kind of re-ethnography, right? Which is what I document in the book, that looks at this question of what does it mean to sort of be a scholar and inadvertently become complicit with something that you don't even realize until it's too late? And then how to think about what it means to criminalize a group of people that you think you're supporting, right? And that's the sort of attention that I think is ongoing in the book itself.
Yeah, and you can see as you build up your conversations and you are visiting and revisiting these people. And let me tell you something, Aisha, I'm a real hater. I actually don't think that you're as much of a hater as I am, because I would have been and your mother, everybody could catch this, right? Such a beautiful job at balancing, right? This moment, there's a moment in which you're oh, maybe Wheatley changed. And then a few chapters later, they're nah, he's still the same son of a, right? He's still the same, etc.
Right.
And so again, I keep thinking about this one man, these one figures, these moments, even or at the end of the book, it also gets, the cases get more and more intense. And then you have this sense of, there's a possibility of, there's always the possibility open for violence with police. And then you're oh, well, maybe this person is a little bit caring. Maybe this person, and then you realize, no, right? That sometimes that glimpse of humanity that can be shown, by the kind of source of the violence, it's actually not, you can't even believe in that, right? You can't even believe in that sense of humanity, because the kind of the finishing blow comes right after, right? And so that's something that I think is, as you're talking, se me para los pelos, right? Because I'm thinking back to the book and thinking back to all of these moments where there was a possibility to make a different choice.
Right.
Every single one of these, police officers and, representatives of the state to do something different, right?
Yeah.
In particular, the medical examiners, right? You're surprised, right? You have this moment where Charles Wheatley, decides to testify on the side of, a priest of Santeria and of a church that is being kind of demonized and being kind of heavily regulated by the city. And so you're
Yeah.
okay, maybe there's a glimpse of something, right? And then you turn around and you see all the way up to his death, right?
Yeah.
This man is hell bent, right, on destroying lives and of creating a blanket of protection for like police violence and the state. And then you see, then what you do is you give us a little breadcrumb to like the people who are doing it now. That was for me the moment I was like, y dale que son de arroz, right? Like, and then here we go, right? And this is a continuing pattern. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that becomes, one of the things that was like so striking to me in, people don't realize that the medical examiner community is actually quite small, right? And so when Whetley is cultivating himself as an expert in the law enforcement circuit in the satanic panic, and then that changes into what ends up being a kind of industry to cover up police violence, right? Excited delirium gets used not just by the police, but also by Taser International, right? And so Whetley becomes an expert, right? A so-called expert and a researcher paid for by Taser. And Taser uses excited delirium syndrome in, numerous lawsuits, that claim, arguing that it's not the Taser that kills people, but it's actually this fabricated syndrome, right? And so this industry of experts, and at a certain point, Taser International buys 1,000 copies, right, of this of a book based off of Whetley's theory and circulates this around the country. Now, if there's only like 500 medical examiners across the country, 1,000 copies is covering everybody twice and all the students, right, as well. So we have to understand the ratio of like what a few people in a network can actually do to really think about this these larger arguments. And I think one of the other elements that's really important here is I tried to really go back, right? Because you mentioned how, Whetley at a certain point actually testifies on behalf of the Church of Lukumi Babaluaye, whose case ends up going all the way to the Supreme Court and wins the Supreme Court, right? In 1993. Well, Whetley is testifying on behalf of the Church of Lukumi Babaluaye as an expert witness to argue that the slaughter of animals in Santeria practices is actually humane. And what's really interesting about this is that Whetley actually gets sort of criminalized alongside the Santeros, right? So the judge doesn't believe him. The judge, thinks that he's like smarmy, and like it's really interesting to see this unfold in the archive. And at a certain point, then Whetley responds and says, we need to have more dialogue. And the very criminalized gaze that he had implemented against the tattoos of the Marielitos, 9 years earlier, he tries to sort of shift that and ends up making friends with a lot of even anthropologists and scholars in the field who are writing about Santeria at this time. But one of the things that you point out, and one of the things that was frustrating to me, is even after, right, Whetley is proven, right, that his cocaine sex death theory is wrong, right, that the Black women were actually likely, raped and murdered by a serial killer, right? Even after all of that, even after the Santeria Church, in the early 1990s, he doubles down on excited delirium. He continues to make the argument that Black people, Black men in particular, are more prone to this so-called syndrome, right? And he does so as part of this larger industry, right? And I sort of trace it all the way through his death, that he sort of makes his career on covering up police violence, right?
Right. And I think there is this this moment in which you can see, and what you show is this palimpsest of like pathologization of Black people, and you do so across space and time. So I want to talk about that, because this medical examiner is just but one of the many layers, right? And I think Josiana Arroyo in the chat is also correctly noting, right, that Fernando Ortiz, right, like that you talk about him as well in the book, right, like, and thinking about the ways these practices are being policed, not just in the US, but also in Cuba, right? Like this is also, and so you really trace this history by going to the archive and looking at the ways that practitioners are being vilified there and policed there, and their lives at risk in Cuba and in the US. But you go beyond, right? wow, you go beyond the kind of Latina experience here. And I think you do so in this really powerful way, because I think for a long time we've been talking, I think ad nauseum about Blackness, right? About the kind of the ways in which Black Latinidad and even Black like US experiences are not exceptional, right? There's no exceptionality here. But in fact, we have to look closer to see the relationality between them. And you do that so beautifully by suturing very painful experiences of Black death, and you do so from enslavement, right? Like you're talking about the plantation as this like this experimental locus for like Black death, and then all the way to our contemporary moment, bringing together, right? Like you are like these 12 Black women, you know, in Miami, Trayvon Martin, right? George Floyd, Emmett Till, right? Like you are moving through. You're like Amadou Diallo, right? Like you go back, and I'm like, whoa, like that is, you know, that is something that is so important. You like Natasha McKenna, all of these people, all of these names you bring up, and you give them sustained attention to their cases, right? You're like, this is what happened. This is what was said. This is what the family reacted. This is how spiritual community in many cases also responded, right? And it's not as if all these people are practitioners either, right? But there seems to be kind of like an ethical impetus that you are pointing to of practitioners of Santeria Lukumi, right? As saying like, we are here as a salve and a balm for these spirits and for the kind of regeneration and the healing of people who have lost loved ones. And so can you talk to me a little bit, and to us, I'm not saying talk to me, I'm sorry, there's mad people here. Talk to us about how you brought these together, right? How you are suturing together these stories that might at first glance seem like, well, that was Oscar Grant in California, and that was, you know, Emmett Till, you know, in the US South. Don't try to come bring these together. And you also do some interrogation of the kind of politics of positivism of the academy, right? So I would love to talk about that as well. I have a question about that later, but you do so in this really exciting and beautiful way, noting, right? Like, what it is that you're doing, but very subtly. So can you tell us more?
Yes. Oh my gosh. There's so many different threads. I'm like, which one do I take? Which one do I take? So, okay. I think I'll start with the thread on bringing these together, right? So one of the things that was important for me to do is, you know, very, you know, importantly to like not reify the idea that excited delirium is a disease, right? It is not a disease. It is a fabricated diagnosis. But what I do argue in the book is that excited delirium should actually be understood as the white gaze, right? That actually criminalizes Black and Latina people in a way that we see from the, you know, plantation slave ships, right? And throughout time, we can look, for instance, in the 1990s to the chief of police, Daryl Gates, who was arguing that Black men are more susceptible to have their windpipes be crushed, right? To the way that medical violence, right, is medical expertise has always been constructed on Black women's bodies, and Black women seen as super bodies actually impacts how Whetley argues that they are cocaine sex deaths, right? And so that these things are not separate, right? And going back to Josiana's you know, point about, you know, the layers of white supremacy, you know, one of the things I argue about is that, you know, the way that early criminology, right, Fernando Ortiz and Lambroso, Whetley doesn't just invent these ideas in the US, right? He's borrowing from Afro-Cuban criminology, right? He's recuperating it in an Anglo-white supremacist context, right? And so these layers of white supremacy that are operating where the Cuban white supremacy meets the Anglo-white supremacy and forges new forms of interaction that enables people like Whetley to then create his expertise based off of the criminalizing of Santeria syncretism, right? And so so for me, it was very important to think about that in terms of like these crossings of race and ethnicity that don't always necessarily make sense, but that operate within creating new color lines, new patterns, and new formations, and in order to trace how the disease, this fabricated diagnosis gets constructed, we actually do have to understand those different kinds of layers of white supremacy. Like we won't understand why someone is seen as agitated, sweaty, and turning into like an Incredible Hulk, unless we understand how Scarface, right, the Cuban Marielito was seen as the epitome of like violence and, you know, and also like racial masculinity at the in that context, that then leads people, right? But it's not just, but we can't just stop there, because there's also like Wheatley at the time is actively citing Jim Crow like literature, right? So he's citing medical doctors from 1914 who were arguing that you know, that you know, people in the Black people in the South were having cocaine orgies, right? And this medical literature was directly used as lynching justification. Like that's Wheatley's precedent, right? So these things are intertwined historically. And so it's important, it was important for me to sort of trace those lines through in order to articulate what excited delirium is, right? Because excited delirium to me does exist, right? It's that Manichean delirium that Frantz Fanon talks about, right? It's the way that the colonizer, you know, creates this subject of, you know, that then, you know, that sort of, that delirium is not the Black and Latine people. That delirium is the white gaze that continuously sees society, that is able to enable society to see these sort of patterns where we can see Rodney King be beaten and claim that the police were in danger, right? Like that is excited delirium.
Right.
And that's sort of the thread of the book, is to bring people who may be skeptical about that to the very end where they see nothing but that, right? And they can't, it's like you're existing in a world where that black and brown people exist in every day.
Right. And it does something, you feel a little bit, I feel a little bit unhinged by the time I read the book, right? I said, I opened up by saying like, I wept, uncontrollably wept finishing the book. Because at a certain point, you know, you're building us up and you're like, and here's another case, and here's another one, and here's another one. And if you don't believe me, here's one more, right? And also, did you know that concrete floor is a weapon? Surprise,
Right.
surprise. Did you know, right? Like, and you're like, no, this is incredibly intense and painful. And I think there's something really powerful about the person who can sit with this archive of the dead and survive telling that story, right? So there's something very beautiful about that, and you, the hands and the mind that are able to bring these together. And I talk about suture, and I mean it in a real way. I mean it as like, you know, you are like pulling these threads that have been so torn apart and cast this way and cast that way, so that we should not be able to trace these things, right? We should be able to just you know, lock in and lock in and believe whatever it is that the news and the medical examiners, whatever, is telling us. And so it takes something very special to be able to be like, no, and here it is, right? Here is this kind of quilt of horror, right? That bears down on us today. It bears on us right now. Actually, as you're breathing, it's here, right? And then you bring that in also with the kind of sense of the spirit world, right? And the kind of ways that we can be cared and protected by our dead, right? And then also the possibility of other non-caring, non-generous dead, right? Also attaching themselves. And you talk a little bit about that experience, right? Like a kind of haunting, the kind of the balm and the salve of your own muertos, and then the haunting of these other muertos that come to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, you know, I think that was also like a really difficult thing to figure out how to address. I felt like I was held accountable by the spirits, both of those who were, you know, labeled excited delirium, right? Those who came to me and haunted me, right? Through this process. And also, you know, being held accountable to my own muertos, right? Who were telling me in, you know, very clear terms that I had invested too deeply into like academic authority, right? And not to, and I think inadvertently, like through the process of, you know, getting a PhD, getting tenured, writing books like that, made it, it created a sort of bifurcation of my own self, that when I encountered this syndrome and the people who had been labeled by this syndrome, like I needed to heal from it, right? And so I talked in the beginning around about Jade's father and how that story was really impactful. Part of the reason why it was impactful was because I had been, not sleeping, right, for weeks. Like I had been having these recurring nightmares, these dreams, and I was seeing this person who I did not know for a few weeks before I went to interview her. And when she told me that, her father had been killed by police and had suddenly up and died, right? I stopped and I looked at her and when she said, I said, was this excited delirium? And she said, how did you know? And I said, I think your dad was haunting me. And she kind of laughed, she was like, yeah, that's on brand. So then she sent me a picture of him, and it was the person who I had been dreaming with for the few weeks before that, and so I really, in many ways, I owed a lot to him because he came to me and I think he made me and also the Black women whose deaths were labeled excited delirium, there was a kind of reckoning. And I've said this before, but like, in Afro-Cuban religions, Afro-Caribbean religions, like we are quite used to engaging with like co-presences. I've called them in my first book, I called them co-presences, right? But, you can do a limpia, you can do a rompimiento, like you can get rid of a spirit, right? So it's not, the problem isn't necessarily knowing how to cleanse a spirit or get rid of a spirit. Like that's actually something most of our grandmothers know how to do, right? The problem is paying attention to the spirit, following the spirit, actually allowing the spirit to engage and not necessarily just like getting rid of the spirit and having them go away. And so this one, I was kind of like, well, how do I do this? Like what, and it was my dad, who is an Oriate, he's an elder in, Orisha has the, Anya drums. He was the one who was like, why don't you start writing down your dreams, like in a journal? And that was the way that I sort of was trying to figure out what these spirits wanted. And they were giving me all of these clues to like figure my way through this. And in the end, I was able to like also have like and reconcile my own healing and my own pathway. And I actually offer my ethnographic journals and my pathway of healing, not as like in an evangelical sense or in a sense of like, oh, everyone needs to take up, there's misogynist and racist, homophobic lukumi practitioners, right? Like this is not in and of itself like a necessarily always a unifying space, but there are those of us who are engaged in communities that do try to do that as well, right? Like as in any community. But the reason why I offer it is really to talk more about like, this is how I made it through, like, this is my healing pathway, and also, these practices were forged out of the very violence that we are talking about and we are uncovering and revealing. And so it was that sort of dual engagement with both like reconciling with like, how do I acknowledge and address these energies that are demanding a different kind of recognition, not just as a metaphor, right? But like if you as a scholar, I'm an anthropologist by training, but there's a lot of ethnographers who are social scientists that make the argument that we take our interlocutors, we take the people that we work with, their cultural practices seriously. We respect where they're coming from. But if we don't actually allow for those spirits to really exist, are we taking them seriously? Like, are we actually acknowledging those cultural practices as places from which knowledge can be made and understood? Because inevitably, by centering the spirits, it has to shift the world, and it has to shift the way we write and we think about the world if those spirits are actually engaging with us, right? It doesn't allow us to just metaphorize which in and of itself is its own kind of positivism, right? There's an embeddedness, within academia in particular, but within scholarship more broadly, there is an implicit sense of authority that is embedded in a positivism, right? And like, I think one of the things that the spirits were demanding of me was to like acknowledge that that's just not the case.
Right. I love that because you answered my very next question, which was about like modernity's insistence on alterity for Black people and also for Black spiritual practices, and the way that you subtly and not so subtly put up a mirror to that and the academy, right? And you talk about your experiences in presenting this work and the kind of both the embrace of it, but then also this kind of skepticism and the demand for positivism, right? Like, where is the proof? I want to see it, right? Where are the numbers? Where is the data, right? And we know
Yeah.
data is not going to save us, and neither will numbers, right? Lord knows they won't save me, but I think there's something really important about like how you've answered, you know, how you've come to answer that last question, because it's not, you know, particular only to anthropology. We're
Yeah.
seeing this across a series of different disciplines, particularly the traditional disciplines, right? And even folks who are in the kind of quote unquote studies also, right? Kind of fall in the kind of trap of proving oneself within the world of like Western epistemology, right? That is the only place where we can find ourselves as validated and as true knowledge holders and you know and creators. There's something that you said, and this is I just want to point to a way that you said something previously. You said dreaming with, right? I was dreaming with this person. So one, I wanted to say that there's something really powerful about the kind of ways like, okay, yo me puedo limpiar de esto, me puedo hacer un despojo or something like, and I can get rid of this.
Right.
But instead, I'm going to follow. And then there's some general interests where you do follow, right? Like you're like, this person came to the dream and I followed them to this parking lot, or I followed them to this place and they showed to me this thing, right? This violence that then you are able to find in the archive. This is really incredible. And I mean that in the kind of ways like it's amazing, because it also buttresses up against that academic skepticism and positivism, right? How can you track, right? Like, you know, unlike the Enlightenment theorists or the Enlightenment philosophers who was like, it came to me in a dream, you know, like now I'm like double thinking, I'm like, maybe it did come to his ass in a dream, you know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah.
There's something there, but I also want to call attention to the phrase dreaming with, right? In English, we say dreaming of, but in Spanish, we say soñando con, right? We dream with this person. And so there's something about that kind of, even in your, like,
Yeah.
this very soft, like, answer, right? Like, you know, this kind of colloquial answer to this is like, yeah, I was dreaming with this person. And what does it mean for us to dream with rather than dream of something and to follow that? So I think there's something very powerful also about the place that not just the sacred and spiritual practices can bring us, but also the ways that like moving between languages can offer us a different sense of relationships with people here and not here. And I think that's just very beautiful. Just like a little thing that I picked up and I was like, okay, soñando con, right? It's not necessarily used in English in that way. And I'm wondering if you want to spill the tea a little bit on the kind of skepticism that you face in presenting this work, because you talk about, you know, being in fellowship, being back at Stanford where you did your bachelor's degree, and
doctorate.
huh? Oh, your doctorate. Yeah, sorry, your doctorate degree. So you're going back to the grad school, you know, playgrounds. This time, you know, as you know, a fully, you know, enfranchised, you know, like professor and researcher. And you talk about these uncanny experiences, number one, which was scary, but then also about presenting this work to the public. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes. It's funny that one comes up a lot. I think that like that moment. So there, you know, there's obviously I include the skeptic for obvious reasons, right? I want, you know, I feel like it's important to address that the skepticism of like, why are you bringing spirits? You can talk. I mean, literally, what he says is one of the fellows says, you can talk about excited delirium without having to bring in anyone's father or spirits. You don't need this. Why are you doing this, right? In a sense of like irritation. And I feel like that irritation is like such an important tension in the book, because it's like you need to contain yourself, right? There's this sense of me being too much, right? Of doing too much, of like bringing in too much of an analysis that doesn't fit. In the words that's used is it's unswallowable for me, right? That was this skeptic, right? But one of the things that, you know, was really interesting, and I really try to talk about physics, because I think physics helps us get to certain places in science that is beyond a kind of Western positivism, right? And, you know, particularly like there's a lot of feminist physics going on that's like amazing work out there. So I try to engage in that. But what happens is this person, right? who in many ways is, so invested in the scientific, positivism, this empiricism, right? He meets with me right after, and the whole, I don't know if I should reveal it, because I feel like that's like such an important part of the book, right? But, one of the core reasons I think that, he is so, let's just say, tormented is because of his own unresolved issues, right? And I don't want to, because I feel like that's like a really important part of the book, so I don't want to give that away to anyone who hasn't read it. But what it reveals to me, is back to what you were describing, which is like, how do we measure proof? And so one of the things that I was trying to do in the book is to show different forms of evidence, right? How we can think about evidence, how we can think about truth, and how we can think about proof, right? In different registers, right? In this kind of multi-genre form of writing. And so you can think about obviously there's a lot of archival, and ethnographic work in the text that all of the research on excited delirium is based in that kind of more traditional kind of evidence, right? That would make most scholars very comfortable, right? It's actually, in many ways, it's very empirical. I mean, if you look at the footnotes, it's really empirical. But the other kinds of evidence, right, that I offer is also the intuitive evidence that like my grandmother and my father and like the people who cultivate a different kind of knowing, right, these otherwise ways of knowing, that kind of evidence is not always as readily available to people outside of certain cultural spaces, right? So like Western ways, and that's not to say like Western culture is haunted deeply, right? Like there's also active spirits, like Whetley in the book is a spirit that was haunting the text and not wanting this research to continue, right? And so I feel like there's, and even the expertise, like the idea of expertise, like citations is a form of haunting, right? When we're citing people and we're writing about people and we're conjuring these energies and people, like, that's why it's actually very important. Like if you're going to conjure, certain kinds of like Freud and Lacan, like we should also think about like, what does that mean? And what kind of energetic work is that doing in our scholarship, in our brains, when when those are the people that are at the forefront of the kinds of thinking that we're doing, right? So anyhow, I could go on and on about that.
No, but I mean, you're talking about these like varying registers that are being like activated for people as they're reading this. Like there's a particular kinds of reader, perhaps someone who is a practitioner or someone who understands the practice, who will read this and be like, yes, I get this all the way through. And there's some people who are the anthropologists, and some people who are the historians, and some people who are the criminologists, right? People will get different things from this. And I think that's the kind of beauty of it. I think for me, the problem persists when people who only get one register are dismissive of the others, right?
That's right.
And there's something there that is kind of insidious and part of the kind of like hierarchical knowledge order of the Western academy and of Western epistemology, right? Like it's always like, am I smarter than you? Am I not? Am I, do I know and it's always a calculus. It's a constant calculus, right? And I think that you do away with that calculus at the outset, right? When you're like, here's the game plan. This is where we're going, right? And you're gonna hold my hand and follow me, or you're not, right? And if you're not, I'm gonna drop breadcrumbs along the way to let you know that I know you're not following me here, right? Like, so there's something really intense and really exciting about that. You get us towards the end of the book, you get us to decolonial abolition. It's woven, right? Like you give us like little inklings throughout. And then at the end, you're like, and here's an example, and here's an example, and here's what it looks like, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about your understanding of the practice and the politics of decolonial abolition?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think exactly, right? So as you're noting, like I want you to take a journey with me, right? And so like the book in and of itself, it expects a kind of commitment from the reader, right? Or is hoping for a kind of commitment from the reader, which is to like, okay, ethnographically, I'm going to take you on my anthropological journey into a different space, right? Like you're going to be deep dived into a space that you might not be comfortable with. And at every turn, you're going to, I hope, feel like your world is shifting more and more, right? And part of that has to do with you know, the question between when we're thinking about like policing and police violence, right? Oftentimes social science that deals like criminological approaches to social science and in terms of policing usually sees policing in and of itself as like a domain onto itself, right? And so you rarely get those who are connecting like the medical and the legal with the with policing, right? And so what I'm also wanting to do is like show people how those are deeply connected to each other. And so we can't just undo one area or think we're reforming in one area, right? And so I take what I try to also do is take us on a journey from the question of reform to the question of abolition, right? And so it starts where, you know, you're getting a sense of like, what does reform look like, right? Like Rafael Martinez's work is like a reform work, right? Like this is someone who comes with good intentions, thinking that they're going to train people, thinking that they're going to be able to like make the system better from within, right? And as you see, right, through every example, through every turn, like as you know, this is there's a way in which that, you know, when you get to the end, you understand that this reform in and of itself cannot work in a system that is based on excited delirium. Excited delirium, which is the white gaze of the criminality, right? And so when we get to the decolonial abolition, you know, I'm like, one of the things that I'm trying to do is like reread W.B. Du Bois as having a good muerto, right? Du Bois, right, talks about like when he's talking about double consciousness, he's talking about a spiritual consciousness. He's talking about the call of like, you know, of what it means to see racial violence, right? And having that sort of that consciousness. And you know, and talking about like Joy James, you know, she's like, let's not just have abolition in like this pretty academic rhetoric, but like let's think about like a blueprint and what that blueprint is, you know, fundamentally looks like. It doesn't have to be completely transformed. It doesn't mean that everything is undone. It's like, how do we build a new future? How do we think towards a new future? And so what I try to do is to bring together, on the one hand, the, you know, arguments around decolonization, which are about sovereignty, which are about, you know, fighting for both autonomy and rights, and also outside of the question of rights, so like pushing beyond the argument around rights, and abolition, right, which is always about creating a new, right, so finding a new pathway forward that that is about imagining new futures. And so I do that with within the community that I'm working with, like the people, the Afro-Cuban and the Lukumi practitioners who are trying to start from a kind of spiritual activism, right? That in and of itself is, you know, drawing on, you know, these spiritual practices as forms of healing and as forms of community making and knowledge production that aren't always seen as a form of activism, right? And so like, you know, my uncle Tobaji, who has, you know, who takes his Anya drums to like Mario Woods's, you know, site where he was murdered by police with the family and offers, you know, Lukumi Itutu ceremony to uplift, cleanse, and heal the family who are, you know, who aren't practitioners of Orisha practices. Some of them are, you know, are Christian and Islam, but they are appreciative of like the Afro-Latine attunement to the world that the Bata drums offer, right? And, you know, I think I offer a few other examples of like transnational connections, right, to people who are building transnational, you know, temple spaces across Cuba and the U.S. despite like all of the ongoing violence, right? And then, you know, also situating it at myself as like, you know, a mother who has lost, you know, family members and children, and like having to deal with like that racial violence very, very intimately in my own life, and the pain of like grief, and like how do we come through healing when you're at your very worst? Like how do you come back from that? Is there a way forward for our children and our grandchildren who are alive and looking for places of hope, right? I think for me, in many ways, I had to also like find my own self recovering from like my own traumas, you know, through that were brought to the surface through this. So
Yeah, there's something, I keep going back, and I can't wait for people to read. I don't want to give away like
Yeah.
some of the more beautiful examples that you give of like what's happening even within your own family, your adult sons and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I do want to say that there's something really powerful about thinking about like Wetley and these other like medical examiners. There's so few of them, as you noted before, but like this one man who can convince a multitude of people that, and then when I think about like the way that you're writing, you're also writing about these practitioners who are so politically and spiritually committed. And they're also just one person or a collectivity of people who have the possibility of also offering, right, a counter to that violence, this like healing, this love and care, like actual physical material care for others. So there's something there. I would have to think through it a little bit more, but as you're speaking, that's what's coming to me. We've talked so much about method. We talked about the kind of form and the genre of this. This is like an anthropology, academic like monograph that is and is not, right? Like it is because it is, but it's not because it does something very different. We talked about the journal entries. I want to say that as I was reading, and this is a question about method, actually. When I was reading, there was a moment that I stopped and I said, like there's so many methods. And I said, oh no, this is the method. And what stopped me dead in my tracks was the dead lead the way. That's the method of this book, right?
Yeah.
And I would love, and maybe that's what I thought, but maybe you're thinking something there. Maybe the method is actually very different. But so I think that was a little bit, forward of me to say that that's what I thought the method was. But I would love to hear more about what it means for you for the dead to lead the way, and also a little bit more about the method. And I want to, and this is going to be the final question, because I think for me, I'm really excited to open up for folks, but there's a sense of freedom. I've read your first book, and it's a beautiful book. This is not that book, right? This book has a particular kind of sense of freedom. It is bringing all types of things in, unapologetic, right? About this, very measured, even like also like the restraint that you had in writing this book. I don't know where you found it. I don't know where you found it to write in this kind of clear and succinct ways about people who are just, anyway, another thing. So there's a particular kind of freedom of the second book. And I'm really kind of like, want to kind of shout out to the folks who are early career scholars, the folks who are graduate students, who are perhaps struggling with the dissertation, struggling with their first monograph, maybe struggling with an article. I think that this is such a beautiful example of what is possible. And maybe what is possible for like the next generation is that they don't have to save it for the second book, right? And that then, sometimes you open the paths of liberation that you never get to benefit from, you know what I'm saying? But there's something really special that's happening here about that. So it's about method. So the question, just to reiterate, it's about method, and it's also about the kind of freedom of the second book. So
Yes.
tell me a little bit more.
It's funny that you say that the deadly the way is the method, because that was that talk that I gave at the Casbis, where the skeptic was really upset, was the title of the talk.
Oh my God.
Way. Yeah. So yes, you're right there. You got it. I think, and that is a Lukumi proverb as well. Ikulo biocha, right? The dead lead the path, right? Of the Orishas, right? And so that is something that like I grew up with as like a fundamental part of like how I understand the world. And I had to sort of return to that space in order to get through this work. And, I think there's so many different layers to like the methods question. And I try to like, in the book, I really try to like address the archival methods that I'm dealing with. And it's funny because I've spoken to a lot of historians who are like, yeah, I'm always haunted in the archives. Like it's not, they're just like, that's their experience, right? And I find that to be, it doesn't, for them, it's like, of course, they would never write that, right? Or they would write it as a metaphor, but they wouldn't actually admit it. And I think part of, the sort of the arc, right, of like what, in Electric Santeria, right, that book was like a 10-year book, right? You have to, there's certain things that you have to do. You have to show that you can like, you're legible in a certain in certain areas, that you are making an argument to the field. And the way that I wrote that book was really arguing with anthropology, right? Like practitioners will, or family members will come up to me and they'll be like, I love the stories of the book, but I can't understand anything else, And like, to me, that's sad. Like, there's a part of me that feels like, is it radical if only like a handful of people can read it? Like, how transformative can we be if like the amazing thoughts of what we're doing as scholars is like only intelligible to like a very small group of people who can like read this very elite language? And like, is that in and of itself a kind of racial aesthetics, right? Writing in a particularly elitist way. And one of the things that I worked really hard, and I wanted this book to be readable. Like, I wanted people to be able to like take it up. And that doesn't mean that it's not theoretical, because for me, it was deeply theoretical, like every aspect of the book. But what I did try to do is, if there was ever a term that felt like it was going to be confusing, if there was ever a term that felt like it was jargony, or that like somebody needed to have read something else in order to be able to understand it, I really went through and like massaged and worked it. And it was hard. It was not an easy thing to do. To like, sometimes it's easy to actually rest on the kind of elite language that we've been trained to write with, right? But like, how do we make those very important concepts that are valuable, that are impactful, like how do we make that legible beyond our small community of intellectuals, right? So that was like something that was really important to me with this book. And I've had some people push back, and they were like, this could never be someone's first book, right? And then I like, in my mind, it's like, well, why not? Like, why can't scholars, why are we not allowing for the kinds of scholarship that would be able to cross genres in this way, right? So yeah, I'm excited to see what kind of work is going to be published by the next generation of folks who are unapologetic and who are forcing us to reconcile all kinds of issues that we bring to the table. And at the same time, there was like a, for me, it was almost like I had to also come out of like my own intellectual closet, and like have to deal with like the fact that I had to let go of my own investment in a particular kind of authority, in a particular type of knowledge production. Like, and then what does it mean for me, who's attained tenure at elite universities with, and so on, right? At full, like how does that then help support the generation of people who do want to write in a way that doesn't reproduce that kind of white supremacy, right? So I operate like in many ways, in and of itself, it's a prayer,
Yeah. No, I love it. And I was going to say, there's something about then being at this side of things and saying, okay, well, we're going to be the next generation of already chairs, directors, leaders of things. And so what is the kind of training for our eye? What's the training for our mind? What is the reminders that we need to have to like walk through with generosity, to walk through this path with care, and to extend to this next generation of scholars a very different kind of academy, a very different kind of welcoming than we received, right? I don't know your experience, but I can just imagine Anthro. Okay. So we have some questions in the queue. So I'm going to start with some of them. I'm going to start from the bottom because there's a few at the top. But Josiana says, congratulations on this brilliant book. She has two questions. The first one is, what has happened to many of the Santeria and Palo communities in the Bay that were there in the 90s? So Josiana went to Berkeley and lived there for 10 years, and she benefited from all the knowledge and ways. And she's wondering if gentrification has switched or changed some of the things that have happened. So that's the first question. Second question is about abolitionism and the question of reparative justice. And so she says, how do you see reparative justice as a theme in your book? And why is it important to read spiritual paths as forms of reparative justice for Black, Brown, and Afro-Latinx peoples? Abrazos y ashe, Josiana.
Aw, thank you, Josiana. Thank you for those questions. Those are so important. Yeah, I feel like honestly, there's a lot of gentrification. I mean, my family had to, get out of the San Francisco, Oakland area because of a lot of the gentrification. So I think a lot of folks have had that experience and have moved out into the other areas like Richmond and, you know, and Vallejo and so on. But there's still active community in the Bay, and another generation, I think, of folks who are coming up, and then the elders who are still there, Bobby Cespedes, my uncle, although my dad's not there anymore, he still goes back and forth, my son, right? So many folks that are doing this, Christina Ochun, right? So many different folks, Iya Amara, Lade. I mean, there still is a lot of like active community. And there's a really great Olarisha United too that are doing this kind of work. So I feel like although it's shifted in terms of like where people are located, there's still like an important, and a lot of us still come back to the Bay, right, to maintain our communities. In terms of the abolitionism, you know, for me, I struggle a lot with like not to create a kind of abolition of tearing down, right? But like in the spirit of abolition as its own form of like a reparative, you know, in many ways like a democratic process, right? Like with like a Black democratic process, right? You know, thinking about like, how do we reconstruct, right? So rather than even repair, I'd like to harken back to like reconstruction and think about abolition as a part inherently of like a reconstructionist movement. And like at that point, I think spiritual pathways have always been, right, foundational to Black forms of repair, reconstruction, right? If you think about the Black churches, if you think, right, like even the civil rights movement, built in the civil rights movement, you think about the candomblé, tejeros, going to spiritual Baptist communities, right? There's always been like a strong spiritual foundation to any kind of like activist work and orientation. I think it's just they've been sort of thought of or theorized separately in many cases, but even looking at like Lukumi Orisha practices from like back in, you know, I try to do looking at the history of the criminalization of mediumship in like New York, right? That was another form of community making of Caribbean, you know, Haitians and Cubans and Puerto Ricans and Dominicans coming together with African Americans in Harlem were all practitioners of like, you know, so this is not new, right? Like this is actually, I think, foundational to this longer history, but I think it's been secularized in a way or written out of the, you know, because there's so much taboo, partially in part because of the satanic panic and the criminalization of Santeria, right? It's almost taboo to speak these things, right? But we know like the practitioners have been foundational to a lot of like the Young Lords movement, Black Panther movements, right? And so on. So I feel like some of that is like also like just sifting through and bringing that to light. So
yeah,
yes.
no, that's amazing. Thank you. So we have a comment from Sarah Bruno who says, "Thank you both for this conversation. It is truly one of my dream conversations. No question, just affirmation." So that's a nice little comment and respite. Pepper you with the next set of questions.
Yes.
Yanis Stiligakis Yanis, you in it to win it. Yanis, you got questions for us. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna start with the one about police training. So Yanis says, your exposure to police training, etc., made me extremely curious about how police are trained to conveniently contrive an escalation when they have an encounter with community and how to cover up their backs against future investigation into the misconduct. Did you work on the police reports in reference to the encounters you studied? Were your interviews with police officers helpful in uncovering the premeditated nature of police practices, which is skewed towards brutalization rather than de-escalation? So that's one question.
Wow. Actually, Yanis, this question is going to be what I'm taking up in my next book. So the ethnographic research that I did with police officers, like the interviews, the ride-alongs, the police academy, all of that, which I've written a couple journal articles on already, like looking at white supremacy and how it's like molded into police bodies, right? So that regardless of whether or not a police officer is not white, right, they can still operate through white supremacy because of the training that these techniques of the body that like are produced through these processes. So that's what I'm taking up in the next book. What happened was, and Ken is actually, you know, was sort of help. allowed me to sort of have the freedom to do this, I ended up writing this huge book, 600 pages. And it was my husband, Lawrence, who said, you know what, this is 2 books. Like, you need to separate this. You need to, like, the Excited Delirium, and take all that ethnography and keep it in the second book. So I actually take all this up in the second book. And it was like, I had this moment where I was like, you know what? He was right. Like, and so then of course I went and I said, hey, Ken, is it okay if I just turn this into 2 books? And Ken was like, yes, no problem. So I was like, give me few months. I'm going to rework this a little bit. And I added in my diary entries, right? And so the first version of the book did not have the diary entries. And I told Ken, I was like, I'm going to go a little bit different on this. I'm going to go through my process of discovery. And, and he totally went with it. He was so supportive and amazing. And I have to say, like, having an editor like Ken allows for those of us who are doing this kind of work to really, like, go there, because it's not easy. Like, it was scary, but he was just so supportive, and he was like, that sounds amazing. You know what? I see it. I get it. Go for it. And so yes, I will be taking that up, but it's not in this book.
I love it, and thank you for sharing that you actually wrote a doorstopper for a first book, and
Yeah.
and I'm so glad that you actually
Cut it in half.
That's divine.
Thank
And
you.
I felt like I won the lottery, because I got
Yes.
2 fabulous books instead of like the one doorstop. So it's like, and
Right.
you got the space to make this one even more innovative and more of a model for the future, like you were talking about, in terms of like what could people do, than it would have been if you had to, like, oh, how are we going to keep this under 500 pages or whatever.
Right. Who's paying for these extra pages? Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
no, you're right. And I think, I just want to underscore what Ken said, which is like a model. Like, it's a
Mhm.
beautiful model, a model, not the model, right? A model
Yeah.
for what is possible.
Yeah.
When you're attuned yourself, despite practice, like one's own sacred exposure practices, but attune yourself to different registers, and the reminding oneself is, who do I want to write for? Who am I talking to? Who am I accompanying in this
Mhm.
journey, and who do I want to accompany me? And I think that your book does a beautiful job of showing us the possibility when you ask questions like that at the very outset. So thank you again, Aisha, for this beautiful and rigorous and very difficult work that you have gifted to us in the world. So thanks.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much, Yomaira. I think this has been such an amazing conversation. I'm really grateful, and you're so smart and so wonderful. So thank you. Yeah.
Well, thanks to you both, because I've just thought this was really fantastic. And the idea of this kind of writing and the different possibilities of writing, I feel like it's something people have to feel like they can do,
Yeah.
And when you look at people, I always think about Christina Sharp or Saidiya, and you look at their 3 books, you see it takes a lot of work to get to this writing. So if you just could wake up and like write your first book that way, more power to you. But, the possibility of being able to say things that weren't sayable, that to kind of audiences and community that you produce through it, anybody could be doing that. And it's just so important. And
And
it's
thank you
been
for
a,
saying that. So sorry. I just want to say thank you for saying that, because I think in addition to like opening up a path for like a method, it's not a desire to add pressure to people to create this like very multi-genre, multi-whatever first book. It really is writing as a practice, and that the idea that there is the possibility to produce this with time, I think, is the kind of end goal. So everybody, no pressure. Okay, just everyone.
Yes, thank
Sorry,
you.
go
Thank
ahead.
you so much.
okay. Well, thank you. Thanks everybody for being here. And I hope that the end of the year goes as nicely as possible. People have very good holidays, and we'll be back with more intellectual publics at the start of spring semester. So thanks very much, and have a good night. Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Yomaira.
Thank
Take
you so
care.
much. All
Bye.
right. Bye.